It doesn't feel as natural. So anyway, welcome to everyone who has joined this webinar. Thank you ever so much for giving up your time, and I hope it will be very much worth your while. And also thank you to the Sports Governance Academy for hosting the webinar. So as Craig has said, I am Dr. Kirsten Fasey. I have spent for my sins 3 or 4 years studying organisational resilience in elite sport organisations for a PhD, and I now work at British Triathlon, not specifically on organisational resilience. Wouldn't it be lovely, those of us working in sport, if we could just have one role and just focus on one thing? But instead, like everybody else, it seems that we have many roles in our organisations. But I am officially Director of People and Culture. Inevitably, my background, though, in organisational resilience research informs the way we do a lot of our work. So I'm hoping that I'll be able to bring some of that real kind of practical applied experience to enhance some of the academic work that I'm going to be discussing today. So let me just get rid of that poll on there. So in terms of what we're going to be running through for the next 45 minutes or so, we're going to be looking at what is organisational resilience and why it matters. I'm going to be giving you a framework to work within, because I think a lot of people are looking for some real practical examples of how they can help improve their organisation's resilience. So we'll be going through 5 key characteristics and then 4 processes. 4 processes of organisational resilience. So we'll go through each of those, explain what they are, and then for each one give some applied examples of how each of those particular factors can be worked on in your individual organisations. And then I'm going to finish up with some questions. People very kindly sent in quite a few questions around organisational resilience in advance of the webinar, which really helped when I was planning the session to explain what people found of interest and where to direct the conversation, if you like. So some of those questions will be answered as we go along, and then there's several of them which are on slides at the end, which I'll be running through. If you have any more questions during the session, then please do pop them in the chat. Craig will either raise them at the end, or if he thinks it's appropriate to interrupt me mid-flow, if that works better, that's absolutely fine also. So without further ado, looking at what is organisational resilience. So when we talk about resilience, and resilience can be in individuals, it can be at teams, it can be organisations, it can even be at a wider level. I'm just going to add some mutes on here. So resilience, whenever we're talking about it, always refers to some kind of significant, unexpected or disruptive event combined with some kind of positive or better than expected outcome. So that's always what we're talking about whenever we're talking about resilience. When we think about the sport organisations that most people will be working in, or any form of organisation, the kind of significant, unexpected or disruptive event that people will have encountered in many instances. Coronavirus is obviously a great example of something that all organisations have had to deal with. Again, at a macroeconomic level, we've got the current cost of living crisis, which presents some real challenges to organisations. And then more around the sporting theme, we've got issues such as safeguarding, which impacts everybody working in sport. And then I've just included this, although it's about football and turnover in football, sport, I think, is an environment that experiences a particularly high level of turnover of personnel, although hearing the news today, perhaps the government is a real contender for highest turnover levels. But all these factors can impact an organisation and require a response. And when we're talking about resilience, as I as I've mentioned, the PhD that I spent 3 or 4 years working towards was the very first time that organisational resilience had been looked at in sport organisations, but obviously it built on a bedrock of other large bodies of academic research. So it's just to explain the different areas, I suppose, that all feed into and all related to this particular area. So you've got a lot of work around individual resilience in sport, particularly looking at how athletes cope with injuries and setback and so on. Similarly, there's team resilience in sport, so how teams deal with particularly challenging events. And then because we're talking about the workplace, the literature around employee resilience is of relevance, of team resilience in the workplace, and then finally organisational resilience from other areas. So although this was the first time that organisational resilience had been looked at for organisations, it has been looked at in a number of other domains, such as healthcare, critical infrastructure, entrepreneurial startups, and so on. So there's a lot of work in and around this area already to build on. So as part of the first study in the PhD, we were looking at, I'm not going to go into methodology here today because I think people are interested in a more practical application of organisational resilience. But we use something called the Delphi method, which is a way of getting a large panel of experts to move towards consensus on particular areas. And we had 62 individuals involved in that research over a 7-month period. And we moved towards consensus on a definition of organisational resilience as the dynamic capability of an organisation to successfully deal with significant change. So it's really important there to note that it's a dynamic capability. So it's not something an organisation has or doesn't have. It's something that an organisation can improve upon and can fluctuate over time. And there's that successfully dealing with significant change. So that's the essence of resilience that I mentioned in the very first slide. And then going on from that, because people can sometimes think about, well, how does an organisation do things? Because at the end of the day, an organisation is just a bunch of people, and it's a bunch of people working together on common goals, typically. So it's saying that that there are multi-level characteristics and processes. So we're interested in employees, teams, and what's happening at the organisational level. Which enable an organisation to prepare for, adapt to, and learn from significant change. And what I'm going to be focusing on today is this framework of characteristics and processes which can contribute to the ability of an organisation to be resilient. So, without further ado, I'll get into this framework. So as I said, there were 5 key characteristics and 4 key processes. I'm going to go through each of them in turn, explain what they mean, and then give some practical examples of things that can be done to improve these various factors of organisational resilience. So the first key characteristic we've got there is structural clarity. So structural clarity is referring to having a clear and effective structure, and it's particularly around communication channels, roles and responsibilities between individuals and teams, and decision making. So the first point of call is having, your organisational chart, so everyone understands who does what and where the sort of decision making channels might lie. But more importantly, and I don't know about the organisations that you all work in, but certainly my experience is that people's roles and responsibilities change, sometimes quite subtly, sometimes majorly over time. And sometimes the people within a team would very easily be able to articulate who is doing what within an organisation, but sometimes other teams are less clear about who is doing what. So this structural clarity is about everybody having an understanding of who does what within the organisation and how communication flows. And an example of a couple of examples of what can be done to aid structural clarity. One is around those roles and responsibilities, so making sure that it's clear who is doing what, not only to the people within a team, but across the wider organisation, and thinking about how do people access that information. And secondly, around a communications audit. So this is something that at British Triathlon we've worked on in terms of understanding where and how and what channels we use to communicate with each other. So, for example, at the end of each week, we have our CEO and one of the directors, and the different directors take turns to give an update just on what's happening in their world during that week. And that's really important in terms of understanding not just when big decisions are made, but ensuring people are brought along on the journey and understand the kind of factors that people are talking about and considering from time to time. And then I'm just muting somebody else here, apologies. The other thing that we've introduced at British Triathlon is something called 10 at 10, where on a Monday morning, the whole organisation jumps online together and there's somebody from each department, and we've got kind of a set rota, and somebody will give an update of what's coming up in their world over the next week or looking forwards, so that people are understanding not just backwards of what people have already done, but it's very much a forward-looking communications tool to understand what people are going to be doing going forwards in case there's conversations that sparks that needs to be had. So, as you say, to improve structural clarity, it's around looking at roles and responsibilities, and communications audits are two potentials there. So moving on to the second key characteristic here. So this is flexible improvement. And flexible improvement is about the capability to learn and adapt, and also a culture in which innovation and learning are valued. So again, it's this mindset, this attitude towards change and adaptation, where people are willing to learn, willing to adapt as circumstances require. And again, as a practical example of moving forward with that culture of innovation and learning, in British Triathlon, we've got something called transition time, just because transitions are a part of a triathlon event. And that is a series of portions of time set aside for learning and development, and really emphasising across the whole organisation how important this is seen as being. So we have time set aside for individual learning and development, time set aside for collaborative learning and development, and also team-based learning and development. But it's not just setting aside that time, it's making sure that everybody within the organisation understands how highly that's valued. So that's trying to move towards, as I say, this culture of innovation and learning being valued. Then the third key characteristic out of the 5 is termed shared understanding. And I like to think of this as being an understanding of the direction the boat's being rowed in, I guess. So it's a shared understanding of the organisation's vision and values. It's also about an understanding of the rules governing behaviour, so everybody knows what is and isn't okay in terms of moving towards those vision and values. And it's also about something called collective efficacy, which is a belief in each other, in your ability to achieve those goals. So that's a real understanding of the direction in which we're going, and a belief in the ability that we all know how we will be rowing, and that we're all capable of rowing in order to get there. And an example of this from our performance team would be, we've got a very embedded set of values at British Triathlon that most people, I would like to think, in the office could quote to you quite easily. But in the performance team, they wanted to take each of those 4 values and create a behavioural charter, which is saying, look, these are the kind of very real manifestations, these are the behaviours that you can exhibit in order to show that you're living our values. So that's bringing that shared understanding to life in a very real way for people. So that's moving on to the 4th key characteristic here, which is reciprocal commitment. And I would say, by the way, afterwards that Craig will have these slides. So if anybody wants access to these slides, then you'll be very welcome to them. So reciprocal commitment is the idea of a two-way partnership between employees and employer, in which employees feel supported, valued and safe. So when I was doing the research around organisational resilience and what a very large panel of experts felt was really important to the resilience of their organisation, and we put forward various factors from all the body of research. If you remember that slide at the beginning that showed, all the different types of resilience research that fed into this, of what we thought might be important. And it was one thing that was important to people working within sport organisations wasn't the level of benefits they received or the level of pay. I guess anybody working in sport will be smiling at this point and understanding that nobody does it for the love of their pay packet, really. But it was about actually this feeling of loyalty between an employer and an employee, feeling like it was this two-way commitment, and that employees were willing to go the extra mile for their employer because they felt their employer kind of had their backs, and they felt supported and valued and safe. So a really easy example of reciprocal commitment would be something like an employee recognition scheme. So again, at Triathlon, we have quarterly awards where peers nominate each other and give reasons according to our 4 key values as to how and why they think people have lived those values during the last few months. And as I say, there's an awards presentation each quarter around that. So that's around reciprocal commitment. And then the final key characteristic, things that are important to an organisation around resilience, is operational awareness. So operational awareness is about the capability to identify and assess the range of options which are available to an organisation. So this is, if you're having to deal with a disruptive event or a significant change, you need to have a way of understanding the environment you're in and what resources are available to the organisation in order to deal with that event. And really importantly as well, alternative viewpoints, access to alternative viewpoints. So an example of what could be done here to help improve an organisation's operational awareness, depending on your particular organisation, would be something like scenario planning. So this would be taking a scenario, and I know this is done a lot in the performance environment, where you think about what might happen when you get to, let's say, well, at the pinnacle, an Olympic Games, but all different kinds of games environments, and things go wrong, and you grab a group of people together to sit down and work through, how they would deal with that. But you can do it in an office environment as well. You can be quite inventive about the type of scenario that might impact your organisation, and bringing together most valuably a technically diverse group of people. So let's say somebody from finance, somebody from marketing, somebody from performance, somebody from grassroots sport, depending on what departments you've got within your organisation, but having those people who are coming at it from a different perspective, and also people who might not work that closely together day to day, so that then they can work together to understand how they might work through that particular scenario. And that can also help with things like shared understanding your capability of your colleagues to overcome that particular event. So scenario planning is an example of how to improve operational awareness. So I'm going to move on now to processes, but just to explain, when I'm talking about characteristics and processes in an organisation, the way I like to think about it is characteristics are perhaps the more static elements of things an organisation has. And when we talk about processes, these are the more dynamic elements of what an organisation does, what it's doing day to day to help improve its organisational resilience. And again, this was a large study. These processes came from a study involving 20 individuals, very senior levels within a number of large and smaller elite sport organisations. And they were interviewed across the 6-month period to look at the changes that were happening within their organisations. and what factors they felt, what they felt they were doing that most significantly contributed to their ability to overcome or deal with those challenges. So here we have, essentially, there were two key processes that came from the huge amount of data. I still remember the reams and reams of paper across the floor and trying to make sense of it all. But the two key processes were around sensing and adapting. And then there were two supporting processes of organisational resilience, which were termed strengthening resources and shielding from risk. So I'll go through each of those in turn. So in terms of sensing, so this is about the need and the mechanisms used to gain an understanding of what is happening within and external to an organisation. So the kind of things people were talking about there were things like employee forums to help people understand what's happening. And also, I know it's sort of a bit of a controversial subject at the moment, but this is where the importance of being back in the office together is really important, because that's when you have those sort of day-to-day conversations to help people sense what's going on. And it's not necessarily the major things, but you're looking out for the rumblings, the early signs of something that might be changing, or there might be a disruptive event coming down the line. So these are thinking about, as I say, how people get to understand what's going on in their environment. A question was asked sent in advance about ED&I in relation to organisational resilience. That wasn't something that was specifically looked at in the research, but certainly one of the findings around sensing was that your ability to sense what's going on within your organisation and around it will be helped by having a wider diversity of perspectives. So I'm not talking there about a diversity of protected characteristics as such, but it's more the idea of people from different backgrounds, different experiences, who are bringing a different perspective to things, and they are more likely to sense issues from, as I say, a variety of different angles that can really help with the resilience in an organisation. So that's sensing. And the last thing there is about evaluating and monitoring. And this is the idea that sensing and adapting, it's not one thing and then the other, and then we stop. It's these two things are happening hand in hand all the time. And when we come on to adapting, you'll see that, you know, decisions are made, organisations adapt, but then it's really important to continue sensing instead of thinking that decision's done and we move on, but continuing to sense for the impact of those decisions and those adaptations, checking in for unforeseen consequences. Essentially, whenever we make decisions, none of us have a crystal ball, and we can't predict accurately what's going to happen, and things are going to happen that we didn't think were going to happen. So sensing is about checking in for those things and then adapting to those as well as they carry on. So that's about sensing. And as I say, it very much goes hand in hand, this constant process with adapting. So adapting is the process of continuously and sustainably adjusting the activities of the organisation to mirror current resource availability. And that's done through open, honest and transparent communication. So this is a real key point for a lot of people, but it's this idea of, as you sense that things are changing, how quickly you move from your long-term goals and your plans and the things that you've put in place in your organisation, how quickly you have to change them to mirror the current resource availability. And this can be increased resources as well as decreased resources. So any change in resources, human resources, financial resources, and so on. But when there's a change, it's that idea that adapting quite quickly to the resources that your organisation's got at any one time. So, you know, examples, cost of living at the moment. I know, again, within British Triathlon, you know, we've got, certainly as far as our grant funding is concerned, it's flat over a number of years, and yet we're faced with ever increasing costs on a number of fronts. So it's keeping under constant monitoring how those resources are changing from time to time, and therefore what impact that might have on the programs that we're intending to run. Another way of thinking about adapting is around coronavirus. when a lot of us were obviously prevented from doing a great deal of our normal activities. And therefore, we actually almost had excess human resources. We had people in the organisation who were sitting around who weren't doing what they were normally doing. And I know there are a number of other challenges that people were dealing with, but that was an example of where organisations needed to adapt their activities to an increase in the quantity of human resources or the sort of headspace that people had available to them. So, as you say, those are some examples of adapting. And then, so we've got these key processes ongoing all the time of sensing and adapting, sitting at the centre of an organisation's resilience. And then supporting that, we've got strengthening resources and shielding from risk. So strengthening resources is thinking about what organisations can do. Here we go, sorry, let me just, oh, that's okay, that's gone. Strengthening resources is thinking about how to enhance the quality and quantity of human, financial and relational resources which are available to an organisation, in order to allow the organisation to spend more time on sensing and adapting those key processes. And one of the questions which came up quite a lot in the questions that people submitted in advance of the webinar was really focused on smaller or volunteer-led organisations or clubs with limited resources, and this idea that, you know, if you've got a lot less resources, perhaps your ability to be resilient is a lot lower. And this was something that was really interesting to explore with some as I say, very senior people within a number of sport organisations. And it was felt that whilst it was acknowledged that there was a certain level of resources an organisation is going to need in order to carry out its day-to-day functions, and without those resources it's going to struggle, and there's no point saying otherwise, that actually too many, particularly financial resources, could hamper an organisation's resilience. The reason being that in order to be resilient, you need to be engaging, as I say, in this constant process of sensing and then adapting to your current resource availability. And the more financial resources you've got, the more likely it is that you're able to ignore the issues that you're sensing. You're able to put off making some of those really difficult decisions, because sometimes this does require, you know, cuts in programs that have been planned for years, or perhaps redundancies, or money being given to one area and not funding another area of the organisation. Some of these decisions can be really difficult, and as human beings, if we don't have to make them, then they can be put off. So those that extra buffer that additional financial resources can give you can sometimes actually hamper the ability of an organisation to be resilient. So when we're talking about strengthening resources, we're talking about quality and quantity. So if we think about quality and quantity of human resources, how to strengthen those, strengthening the quality of human resources, and specifically the ability of your people to deal with disruptive events and significant change. I guess one of the main areas that came out was around exposure to challenging scenarios, which also has links in with the individual resilience literature. So this idea, certainly in a performance environment, you wouldn't take either athletes or support staff straight into an Olympic Games environment. You might expose them first of all to a local event and a national event and a European event before they start going to international events. But you can start thinking about it in terms of, you know, the staff within the rest of the organisation and all kinds of teams, and thinking about actually how do you let these people be exposed to what might be quite time pressured or difficult decisions, or where they need to do a lot of research, or there's some kind of pressure that they're not used to, and be supportive, but make sure that people are exposed to that. And it's not always the same people within the organisation who are dealing with things when times get tough. So that's around strengthening the quality of human resources. When we talked about quantity of human resources, this wasn't necessarily the number of bums on seats within an organisation, because that, you know, there's limited control over that, but it was about the importance of the people who are within an organisation having a quantity of time, headspace, in order to engage in the process of sensing and adapting, and be able to spend time figuring out what's going on in their environment and thinking about what changes the organisation might need to make, not just at a senior level, but at all levels within the organisation. So if people are always running at 110%, and again, that seems to me something that sport organisations can be quite guilty of, then it's going to be very hard for your organisation to be resilient, because people have just got their head down the whole time and they don't have time to engage in these sensing and adapting processes. So that's about strengthening the quality and quantity of human resources. Financial resources, the focus there, I've talked a bit, as I say, about the quantity and of resources, but around the quality of financial resources, there was a real focus there when people were talking to me about having more sustainable financial income streams, having more foresight as to what was coming down the line. And they did that through strengthening their relationships with whether it was their key funders or key partners, whoever it might be, so that they felt those relationships were more sustainable, rather than lumps of money sometimes arriving and then being taken away and with very little notice. The quality of financial resources is really about understanding the sustainability of those income streams. And then the final bit here is about relationships that at times, particularly of acute disruption or significant change, having those relationships with people, other organisations who can call on for support in times of need. And that support sometimes might be tangible, say physical resources. If there was, you know, flooding event, let's say, in a training facility, it could be emotional resources. So we had CEOs who were going through really challenging times within their organisation, and having that support of other people around them, that network. It could be informational resources of understanding where to go for information. So, but those relationships were a really important source of additional resources to an organisation during times of need. And an example of what can be done alongside all the bits I've mentioned is stakeholder engagement planning. So that's understanding who those key relationships are that are going to be sustaining you, particularly in times of need, or where you need to create those sustainable income streams, and then making sure that the relevant individuals are working on maintaining those key relationships. And then finally, in relation to the supporting processes, as I say, we've had sensing and adapting, and then to support sensing and adapting, we've got strengthening and shielding. So shielding from risk is about protecting the organisation through internal and external shielding processes, which allow an organisation the space to strengthen resources and to engage in those sensing and adapting processes, and to build a future resilience capability, with the idea that if an organisation is constantly being buffered by change and disruption, then it's very hard to focus on the future if you're just trying to sort of firefight the whole time. So internal risk mitigation, that's the kind of things that I know the Sports Governance Academy have got lots of resources on their website around those good governance processes. And these are things like making sure that you've got a well-functioning board who has oversight of the organisation, risk registers, reserve policies, all these kinds of things that most people are quite used to. And then external influencing is another key part of shielding from risk. So this is about making sure that you understand where you have a voice at a national level, maybe at an international level, so that you can influence key decisions that are made that are going to impact your organisation, so that, again, hopefully they're not unduly disruptive when key decisions are made by those policy-making bodies. And an example of what might be done here is mapping those relationship networks. So who on your board knows who in your senior leadership team, who in the rest of the organisation has got links, where have they worked in the past and so on, who's got a voice at various tables that can be used to influence that external environment. So let me just take a drink of water here. So that's the framework for the 5 key characteristics and the 4 key processes of organisational resilience. And I'm now going to jump on to some of these more practical questions that have come in from people who are hopefully on the webinar today. So the first one, what's the most impactful thing an organisation can do now to prepare itself for resilience in the face of an unforeseen crisis? Yeah. Great question here. Hopefully, as you all have seen as we've run through this, there's not one thing that is going to be the best thing for every single organisation to focus on. It very much depends on your organisation and where your strengths and weaknesses are. But as a practical example, in the 4th study of the PhD involved going in and working with a particular organisation to do some intervention work, to work on their organisational resilience. And the way we started there was to involve the sort of, I guess it was kind of middle management and senior management. It involved about 20 people, going through this framework of characteristics and processes with them, and then asking them to select which of them they felt, or to rate them, which they felt were the most important to be worked on within their organisation. And also, really importantly, which they felt would have the most impact, because there might be areas within your organisation that are particularly weak and that you're going to struggle to work on. There's no point, obviously, pouring all your resources into those areas. So following those ratings from the leadership team, we identified 3 areas and then set up 3 working groups, which met every couple of weeks for a 2 or 3 month period in order to help improve those areas within the organisation. But that involvement of the leadership team in selecting the areas to work on was really important in order to create some responsibility and accountability, because it's all very well coming into an organisation and saying, right, you need to do this, this and this. But if there isn't that buy-in throughout the organisation, it just won't work. So we found that collective accountability and responsibility, as well as then the expertise coming internally, we used a lot of skills that were already within the organisation from individuals who already worked there to lead some of those working groups, and that was very impactful with that organisation. So that was one question. How can sports councils support partners to be more resilient? Great. I love to see this question, because sports councils are such an important part of the ecosystem that sport organisations work within. And there's a few different areas here that immediately come to mind. One is around the strengthening resources part of that sort of supporting process of organisational resilience. And what I mean here is acting as a central hub to understand where the resources are spread throughout sport organisations. And then when individual organisations are struggling, it's not necessarily the sports councils themselves that need to be the source of those additional resources, but they need to be aware of what other organisations might be able to step in and support that organisation that is struggling at that particular time. So it's, as you say, it's this sort of central coordinating hub for shared resources. Also, the aspect of shielding from risk that we just talked about, that external influencing piece is, again, a huge part of what sports councils can and already do, which is the idea of making sure that they have a voice at important tables in government and on national and international bodies, to make sure that the sports organisations that work within their ecosystem aren't constantly impacted by sudden, unexpected events. And then the final thing here is not being the source of disruptive or unexpected events themselves. I'm aware that sometimes, for example, resources can be made available, perhaps with relatively little notice, which seems like a benefit if there's some additional resources that are available, but it's quite disruptive to an organisation which will have already planned what it's doing and the direction that its boat's rowing in, to suddenly potentially be pulled in a different direction. And I know that that's never the intention, but that can sometimes be the impact of say. So it's being predictable in terms of the resources that are going to be available in the future so far as possible. Thoughts on the link with individual resilience? Yeah, really complicated and messy, but I'll try and simplify it a little bit. So individual resilience relies heavily on the environment that somebody's operating in. So no matter how resilient an individual might be, if they're in a difficult environment, there's going to become a point at which they can no longer have a positive outcome from disruptive events because things are just too challenging. So certainly having an organisation which is not constantly reeling from a number of different disruptive events and struggling to cope with them will provide a more stable, supportive environment for individuals to display their own resilience. As far as organisational resilience is concerned, I've already mentioned about strengthening human resources as being a factor which contributes to an organisation's resilience. So that includes, like I said, exposing individuals to more challenging scenarios, which will help improve their individual ability to deal with challenging events, which will ultimately benefit the organisation. What's interesting here, though, is this is not linear. So there's quite a lot of interesting research that's starting to come out about how individual and team resilience could be negative for an organisation's resilience. So if you think, for example, about an individual who is feeling overburdened, then the most resilient course of action for that individual might be to withdraw, to not spend so much time at an organisation, not invest so much energy in it in order to preserve their own well-being. But for an organisation's perspective, there's a withdrawal of resources. So that's one thing. At a team level, it might be that a team is impacted by a significant change or event and it impacts one team more than another. And so that team might decide to, again, kind of withdraw its resources from the rest of the organisation in order to focus on its own goals. And that could be the most resilient way of that team dealing with an event, but perhaps not the most beneficial for an organisation. So I hope I'm painting a picture there of something that is quite complicated and messy, because I think we need to embrace this as being quite a messy area in order to move forwards. Another of the questions which came through, which I'm not going to go through in particular detail, but they were talking about a complex systems approach. And that's very much the approach that we take when using this perspective of organisational resilience. So it's the idea that an organisation has many interacting parts and that you can't control and predict what's going to happen, despite many management textbooks suggesting that people can do this. But we all know from our own experience that organisations can't be controlled and predicted, and things happen all the time that are unexpected. So that's why instead, in this perspective of organisational resilience, we focus on really sensing and adapting to those events rather than trying to control them or stop them, which links with the next question, which was about, does it matter if organisational resilience is top down or bottom up? So as I've just said there, the sort of idea of leadership being able to sort of have a command and control over an organisation is not something that really bears out in most people's experiences of their organisation. There is a role for leadership, absolutely. And an example might be around when we talked about the 5 key characteristics of organisational resilience, that characteristic of shared understanding this was the idea of the direction that the boat is rowing in. That's absolutely something where leadership will play a key role in enabling the whole organisation to have a shared understanding of the vision and the values and the accepted behaviours within an organisation. Whereas when we look at something like sensing, so that was one of the key processes of resilience, sensing is very much a bottom-up factor, if you like, in that it's really important that everybody within the organisation is engaged in trying to make sense of what's happening and what events might be coming up and what disruptions there might be that the organisation might have to deal with. So as I say, it's not linear, it's not top down, it's not bottoms up, it's this complex systems where, as I say, all parts of the system are interacting at all times, and there are events happening externally and internally, and the real focus therefore is on trying to figure out what's going on and what needs to change, rather than, as I say, thinking about how to control and predict things. A few more questions here before we get on to see if any have been raised in the chat. One of them was about differentiation between human organisational resilience and technological / operational organisational resilience. I don't want to get into this in too much detail, other than to flag that when everything I've been talking about here is about human resilience, or psychosocial, humans interacting in order to form resilient organisations. The various terms are used by different people in different ways, but the way I interpret them, technological organisational resilience is more aligned to the work around high reliability organisations. So these are, let's say, your aircraft, or your critical infrastructure, nuclear power plants, these kind of organisations that we can't allow to fail. And therefore there is an emphasis there on how to predict and prevent things happening, quite understandably, particularly if there's a lot of technology that could fail, then there is potentially an ability to predict and prevent that in a way that just isn't applicable in psychosocial systems, human beings interacting. And when we talk about operational organisational resilience, that's more about from disaster recovery area. So this is the idea, which used to be quite popular and still is relevant in certain areas, of organisations having kind of a baseline steady functioning, and then they're impacted by a sudden disruptive event, and then it's about how quickly they can bounce back, return to normal, return to some kind of baseline functioning. But in most sports organisations, as I've lived and breathed them, life isn't that simple. There's not, if I ask somebody, what does baseline functioning look like in your organisation, I think people would struggle to tell me. And if I said to them, what's it like when you have this one event and then you return to normal, people would say, well, I've got 10 events that I'm trying to deal with at the moment, whether it's the aftermath of coronavirus and, event numbers perhaps and participants, whether it's lack of return to pre-corona activity levels, whether it's cost of living crisis, all these things we are still dealing with on an ongoing basis. And it's never that challenging events line up in a nice order and impact an organisation one at a time. That doesn't really ring true. But so that's a bit about those different phrases that you might come across. Self-assessment methods, I think we've just got 2 more questions on here. Self-assessment methods, there's no industry standards for measuring organisational resilience. As I've explained, this is a very new area, so there's no validated instruments in this area. I did create a survey for the purposes of my research, which again, if anybody's interested, I'd be happy to share with you. It's not validated, it doesn't have any research behind it, but it was just a useful tool for the research I was carrying out. You can also use, as I've explained, just asking people. It's a very crude method, but it really helps to get that organisational buy-in of understanding what do people within the organisation think are their areas of weakness, because then you've got some buy-in, some accountability to do something about them. And then the final bit, resources available in this area. There's an excellent website called resorgs.org.nz. Again, I can share that via Craig. It's basically a group of researchers who've done a huge amount of research based in New Zealand, and they were funded by the government following Christchurch earthquakes that happened 15-20 years ago now. But their website's got a lot of resources. Just a word of warning that they're coming from the area of resilience as being this kind of disaster recovery. So this idea of baseline functioning and then a significant event and recovering from it. So it's from a slightly different perspective, but people might find something there that's of use to them. And of course, there is an excellent essay available on the Sports Governance Academy website around organisational resilience. I'm sorry, I've taken longer than I thought I would there. I will switch now to looking for Craig and seeing if there's any questions at the end here.
Yeah, we've got a couple of questions coming in. Just thinking, just as you were talking at the end there, it popped out to me again when I was rereading your essay yesterday, this idea of sort of letting go, which can be sort of counterintuitive to a lot of organisations. But I suppose I'm minded of two quotes, one from Harold Macmillan about events, dear boy, and the other in a similar vein, the famous philosopher Mike Tyson, who said something like everyone has a plan and then they get punched in the face. So that sort of reactivity, but I guess it must be sort of anathema to some organizations, particularly, we've all come across sort of control freakery boards and senior management teams who just learning to let go. It must be quite a significant cultural change, I would have thought.
Yeah, I think so. And it's something that I think people struggle with, particularly from their boards. I think people at the sort of operational level find it a lot harder, a lot easier to understand and get on board with it. But particularly if you've got board members who might have retired from business and are now lending their expertise, but perhaps came from a time when operating in business when the environment was a bit more predictable, and therefore they're making demands about being able to see forecasts and budgets many years in advance, whereas a lot of people realise that the world seems to be changing a lot more quickly, and therefore the ability to adapt and be agile is more important, while still maintaining this sort of eye on longer term, what's the direction you're going in, but very much focusing on short-term adaptation.
Yeah. Okay, we've got a couple of questions in the chat. Is there a potential conflict between aiming for a resilient organisation and extreme efficiency?
Good question. Yeah, I struggle with the idea of extreme efficiency in terms of this sort of very process-based idea of organisations. Human beings are very messy, and the way we interact is quite messy. And if you try and get human beings to be heavily process-driven, you potentially miss some of that sensing and adapting that's so important. So I think that whilst processes are great to take away to streamline certain areas of an organisation, and I know we've recently introduced some fantastic project management software to really streamline the processes where we're repeating the same thing again and again, but quite often a lot of the tasks we're doing aren't like that, and therefore to aim or to push for some efficiency can push out some of that flexible innovation that's so important in order to be able to deal with new novel challenges that an organisation faces.
Yeah, I've got a question here, which I think is probably on a number of people's minds. Any thoughts on how we overcome inertia with partners within our network who they're not confident about their resilience, but say that they don't want any help towards building it?
Yeah, this is a really challenging one, and this was part of, as you say, the fourth study I did with the PhD was looking at, and there's not enough research in this area, right? When we're talking about human beings, you can look at all these factors, but if people won't enact them for whatever reason, then it's not going to get very far. So you really need to look at the processes and not just the outcomes. And things we were looking at there were around, as I say, how to create this collective accountability to get buy-in so that people choose the areas that they want support with, that they want to work on, and the in-house expertise we felt was really important. So instead of people coming from on high and saying, here's all the things you have to do, it's saying to organisations, right, which areas do you want to work on? And it might not be, if you're standing from afar and looking at them, you might think, you've chosen completely the wrong area, you've got that all wrong, you actually need to work on X. But there's no point telling them to work on X. It might be the thing they need to work on, but if they're never going to do it, then it's pointless. So let those organisations choose for themselves, take some responsibility over what they're doing, and look at the in-house expertise that they've got available to help them, again, rather than parachuting expertise in and then working with them, and then it gets withdrawn again, and then they're left in the same situation they were before. It's about creating that change from the inside. And another factor that was really important in that was enjoyment. Sometimes, particularly as an academic researcher, I can forget, but it was so important in the success of the interventions that we did within an organisation, that they were enjoyable, that people wanted to participate in them. So that's another key factor that we can forget.
That's great. I think we did have another couple of questions, but I think they've been picked up in part in some of your comments there, and we are right up against the time now. So apologies if we didn't get to your question, but thank you everybody for joining today's session. Obviously, thank you very much to Kirsten for such an interesting introduction to this topic, and I know that she could go into some massive depth about all of it, but hopefully this gives you some idea about what's involved in this topic and some tips for you to take away and try and implement in your organizations. Just a quick shout out from me: if you go over to the website and you haven't read Kirsten's essay, please do. There's more detail in there, and also you can have a little explore around the other SGA resources. But otherwise, please feel free to get in touch with me or the SGA directly if you have any suggestions for future topics or future things you'd like to see us cover. We're all ears, and we're just in the planning phase for the next couple of years of content. So all suggestions and requests are extremely welcome. So thank you, everybody. Thank you for your time this morning, for your interest in this topic. It's obviously a vital topic, and maybe we'll do more on it going forward. So thank you, everybody, and thank you, Kirsten.